Grace and peace to you. This is Pastors for Pastors, the podcast that supports and celebrates pastors. I'm your host, Ken Broman, folks. We are living in a world where there's a great deal of stress and disagreement. Churches struggle to decide whether to meet in person, require masks, have singing, and figure out how to navigate technology of hybrid worship. There is a lot of disagreement about these questions, and when there's disagreement, pastors are going to hear about it from those who disagree with the decisions. Criticism, disappointment, anger, and division are rampant. What is in short supply is encouragement. Stanley Ott, who goes by Stan, and Lee Zehmer are advocates for the power of encouragement. Stan is president of Leading Moments, whose mission is to develop vital leaders for the church and the world. He's also author of several popular books, including Pray Daily, Igniting Our Passion for God, 12 Dynamic Shifts for Transforming Your Church, and Transforming Your Church Through Ministry Groups. Lee serves as Transitional Pastor of the First Presbyterian Church in High Point, North Carolina. Together, they host a podcast called Building One Another. We got together recently for a delightful conversation about pastoral and congregational vitality and the power of encouragement in a fault-finding world. I do want to thank both of you for joining me for this edition of Pastors for Pastors. It's good to be with Stan and Lee and talk a little bit about the principles of encouragement and how, particularly in these days and times, that principle is so important for our pastors and our congregations. These are challenging times indeed, and we all seem to hear about criticism and negativity and divisiveness, and the unifying forces of encouragement and vitality are something that we really need to hear about. So thanks to both of you for being with me today. I appreciate it. What I am interested in starting with is just to talk a little bit about how the two of you, what your backgrounds are, and how the two of you met and got to work together. Tell us the story.
Well, I'll go ahead and start. So I'm now in the 30th year of ministry, was ordained in 91, served a church in Virginia for 5 years doing college and youth ministry, then went to the Charlotte Presbytery, served a church there for almost 10 years. And then I moved to Lexington, North Carolina, and began with the First Presbyterian Church there. And when I came to that church, I joined Salem Presbytery. And I would say that it was probably somewhere in the area of 2009, 2010 maybe, that this strange man came to Presbytery to do a thing called the Acts 16:5 initiative. And I remember the first large group gathering was actually at the First Presbyterian Church of Winston-Salem. And I went to that and I listened to this guy talk, and he made so much sense to me. I had finished my Doctor of Ministry degree, and I had learned a lot about the shifts in the church. But I didn't see how to put tires on the car, so to speak. I'd learned all this new information about the transforming church, the transitional church, but it was all head knowledge, and I couldn't understand how to make it applicable in the local church. And this guy named Stan Ott was given all these wonderful ideas about how to make this real and actually applicable to the local church. And it really spoke to my heart. And so we participated in this 3-year endeavor with Stan as one of the local churches, and it really did help me in my ministry in a very practical way. And then a couple years later, Stan had this program at equipping pastors that he called the Barnabas Institute. And in my role as the chairperson of the Church Growth and Transformation Committee, we brought Stan back to Salem Presbytery to do that program. And it was through that program that Stan and I really started to get to know each other. And as he will say, I started bugging him about a podcast. So I'll hand it over to Stan. And Stan, from your perspective about how we met.
So he was stalking you. That's what
Yeah.
what he's saying. He was
Yeah.
stalking you, Stan.
And yes, and he didn't
Yes.
say for like 5 years. This guy never let go. Well, and kind of my side of it, if I start behind the goal line, but it makes some sense. I went to Purdue University to study in the field of engineering. Graduate work was led to faith during what in the country was called the Jesus movement, and was looking for a Kmart one Sunday morning, got lost, and drove up in front of a Presbyterian church Sunday morning at 11 a.m. So I thought,
because Presbyterian churches and Kmart's look a lot alike.
They look the same, and so I knew very little about church, but the pastor Jim Tozer immediately connected with me, and I with him. And that congregation was what I would call a standard worship, a women's ministry, a men's group, Sunday school, et cetera. And something happened and the place exploded. People became very excited about their faith. And nobody knew why, really. And so I was still attending as a grad student. We went to seminars all over the country. And what we learned was we were program experts. We knew how to run a program for men, women, kids, youth, mission, but we had no idea how to design ministry appropriate for our people in our situation, you might say. And I wound up commuting to seminary in Chicago, McCormick, one day a week, and joined the staff of that church, was eventually ordained, and moved from there to a congregation in Pittsburgh, which was a wonderful experience. And that congregation had been putting along, same as the earlier one, except I'd learned a little bit about concepts of vitality, and the congregation began to get going. And there was this sense we should give away what we've learned, which led to the 3-year experience we call the Acts 16:5 initiative. Acts 16:5 is the churches grew in numbers and in faith daily. And, we wanted to do that. And so Lee and I got connected that way. I wound up doing that full time for about 15 years, connected with a congregation in Northern Virginia, Vienna Presbyterian. And today I'm theoretically retired, but that word means nothing, as you know. I had one very fun thing happen last year. The congregation I was with part-time, the pastor retired, and the new one was not coming for 5 months. And so they asked if I would be the gap pastor, not really interim, because all the pieces were set, but it allowed me to be a part of a wonderful congregation for 5 months in the middle of a pandemic, which meant all the stuff I've been watching all my pastor friends go through, the good Lord allowed me to experience. And, it's very exciting, very frustrating. If you say absolutely know what to do, then you don't.
So you talked about learning some of the principles of vitality. Talk about what those are, what those were, and how you began to apply those that made that difference.
What are the aspects of Christian faith? You can list so many things you're supposed to do. You wind up, as one seminary professor said, it's not this one thing I do, it's these 40 things I dabble in. And so we said, well, there are 3 basic commitments or dimensions: the Lord who loves us, the people of God who love us, and the world to which we are sent to love. And to help people live in their private, personal lives, those three. How do I grow in my love for my Lord? Me. My love for people of God? Me. My heart to be sent to the world? Me. But then the congregation. And that led to a concept we called reach, grow, send. How do we reach the uninvolved and the uncommitted out in our communities with the love of our Lord? Grow. How do we grow with them in the faith? How do we send them and us back out into the community? That's a very different way of thinking than running a program.
Yeah.
We talk a lot about the principle of pizzazz and commitment, which is fun because that's not exactly in Scripture.
I don't remember that word pizzazz anywhere in
But
Scripture.
like the missional movement, and I'm a big fan of missional, but it began to say there's a difference between missional and attraction. And I would say, no. We want to call people together, ecclesia, the assembly of the called out ones, but also send people. It's just that in our day, you need imagination to figure out how to touch people. And then the pandemics made this even more complex. But pizzazz is the wow. A pastor friend and I had lunch once, and he was clearly not in a good mood. And he's the one that said, all I want to know is, are you guys into pizzazz or commitment? Because all he saw was the fluff stuff we did. And I said, Bill, you see the fluff stuff, which is trying to touch people at their points of need. But we have all of our people meeting in groups of 3, 4, or 5 privately for Bible study, for mutual prayer, for mutual encouragement. And that's where it really happens. But you can't see that. It's invisible. So the pizzazz is very visible, but the commitment is very rich and deep. And either by itself is kind of not it. Acts 2:42 to 47, there's very clearly pizzazz and commitment going on.
Talk a little bit more about what you mean by pizzazz.
What is it that inspires a sense of expectation, of wow, of the Lord who loves me is a part and parcel to what I'm about. A sense of anticipation, you might say. For example, we had a fire engine come one day, Sunday morning, and kids were outside playing with the fire engine. We say, what's that got to do with church? It's just fun. It's just adding a little layer of craziness. On July 4th, we're out front of the church playing brass instruments and giving away free fried chicken. And I went to the bank the next day, and the tellers were actually talking to each other. Did you see what that crazy church did down the street? And every one of them said, if our lives would permit it, that's where we would go. It's just a sense of fun. And I'll tell you, in a pandemic especially, where so many people still feel trapped. There's a book that Lee and I have both read called The Power of Moments by the Heath brothers. And it's well worth reading because they talk about ways to create a sense of power or pizzazz in the ordinary moments.
You're trying to come up ways to attract people and bring them into the fellowship of the church, in which they can then begin to go deeper with other people. I think the most impactful thing that I've learned from you, Stan, is the micro group, where you have 3 or 4 people who meet together on a weekly basis for scripture study, reflection on that scripture, and then sharing prayer requests and praying for one another. And the idea behind that is that you commit with this small group of people for a year, and then the next year, each of them will start their own group with 3 or 4 people. And then you get this geometric kind of progression as it continues on. But it's in that small group where you can really be vulnerable and really support one another that I think the growth and discipleship really occurs. I think that's for me has been a key.
In fact, when the pandemic started, excuse me, we put together a website, pod-church.com, about microgroups. And the beauty of pods or microgroups is people can do that using Zoom or other platforms from their homes. It doesn't have to be a sophisticated church program with great organizational requirement.
That is one of the impacts of the pandemic, is that we have been forced, even we Presbyterians have been forced to become a bit more flexible and find new ways to do the things that we've done all along in person, to find other ways to do it. Talk about the Barnabas Project. Talk about the ideas of encouragement.
Yeah, one of the concepts Lee and I talk about is that the Christian faith is a lifestyle to be lived before it's a program to be run. And as a pastor, I respect that pastoral leadership wrestles with programmatical matters all the time, and people they work with to do those things, because program is just organization to help people, not absolutely appropriate. But all of that energy doesn't necessarily translate to helping people in their private experience become encouragers. Lee and I were talking about a book by Lionel Whiston a few podcasts ago called Are You Fun to Live With? And we thought, well, that's enough to make you think for a moment.
Yep.
But when the average person thinks about you, meaning whoever's listening to us right now, do they think of you as an encourager, as a person who puts steel in your backbone, as a person who your words put them on their feet? That's Job 4:4. It's my favorite Job verse.
Yeah.
Your words put people on their feet. All the rest of it's a little suffery.
Yeah.
But encouragement, 1 Thessalonians 5:11, therefore encourage one another as you've been doing. And the word encourage is that marvelous word paraclete, which means somebody who comes alongside to help. And so our podcast, basically, we call each episode a transferable concept. We want it to be so bite-sized, so understandable, that the listener could reproduce it in somebody else without losing any of the content, so that the seed would spread. Because you take a concept like people eyes, which are the eyes of Jesus for people, and it's very easy for people to pass that idea along. And most of us, to be polite about it, don't have people eyes. We have busyness eyes. We have talk to my best buddy eyes. My wife, Anne Marie, started to talk this morning, and I could feel her tone of voice shift. Well, I was reading my phone. I did not have Anne Marie eyes.
Right.
Yeah, and I think one of the underlying themes for all the podcasts is intentionality. Entering your day with the understanding that you've got to be intentional about it, or the day will pass by you and you'll miss it. Whether that's open saying a simple prayer, Lord, help me today be able to see with Jesus's eyes those around me, or help me to say some kind words to somebody to bless them with some encouragement. Because if we're not intentional about it, very oftentimes we'll get to the end of the day and nothing's happened. So I would say that the intentionality is an undergirding theme to what we're doing.
Kind of with that, Lee, you remind me, we did a podcast on something called a prayer covenant. A prayer covenant, just a prayer agreement, a prayer partnership to pray for another person and they pray for you for 1 week or 1 month. It's just a little more formal than, oh yeah, I pray for my friends. When Phil and I or Janice and I agree to pray for each other every day for a week or a month.
This is my little prayer covenant card
Okay.
that I will hand out to people.
We have found ourselves doing a lot of what I've come to call sofa church during the pandemic. For health reasons right now, my wife and I do not feel free to go to in person. And that's true for a whole lot of people. So we tune into worship services and the service ends and it's done. Whereas there's a prime opportunity to give me a link, evangelize me, win me, sell me, move me, to hook up with somebody, get on Zoom, 3 other people, 10 other people. But what happens is I just close the computer and go get another cup of coffee. I talked to a young man who's in his middle 40s, and he said, well, to be honest, we find online a little boring, and our 3 kids who are under the age of 10, there's no way they're going to watch it. And so in real life, they're on a Peloton. The under 45-year-olds are disconnecting. And so it's the kind of thing where congregations looking for ways to pivot, to be nimble, to grab a hold of people and give them believable ways to connect. It is where we are right now.
Maybe, Lee, I'm particularly asking this of you since you are, of the 3 of us, the only one who is still working. The one word that I keep hearing from pastors that I talk with, either on this podcast or in other ways, or I keep reading about, is the exhaustion level of not just pastors, but lay leaders in churches, everybody who is trying to keep the church going during these times and having to deal with the stresses of learning new ways, technical things that they may or may not have interest or gifts for. And as we all know, don't always work. Even if you do it exactly the way you did it last week, it's not working now. And how do I get it to work, and the pressure I'm under? That is also exhausting.
I think that the challenge is this constant need to not necessarily innovate, but learn something new every week. And I think you stated it pretty well. Is that we had to learn to be televangelists, so to speak, overnight, and then it shifts. I like that. I remember it was, I don't know, a couple weeks ago. We went to start our live stream and it wasn't working. I couldn't figure out why, and it was 5 minutes to 11, and
pressure,
yeah.
Tension.
And so I was running all over the church trying to find out what was the issue. And fortunately, I just had to. What it was the streaming hardware. I just had to reboot it for whatever reason it had locked up. But I do. I think pastors are tired. I think lay people are, because they're being forced to think and consider new things all the time. And that's good, because maybe we needed a kick in the pants to get out of our ruts that we were in. But the constant need to either innovate or do something new to continue the ministry is tiring. And I think words of encouragement are, "Hey, you're doing a good job. It's okay. We're in uncharted territory, And the only way to deal with uncharted territory is to be experimental and realize is that some things aren't going to work, and that's okay.
A lot of people seem to be checking out. We're hearing of increasing numbers of ministers who've decided I'm going to go ahead and retire early because I can't do this anymore, or finding other lines of work. And uh, I'm just curious how we can apply those basic, simple but deep principles of encouragement, covenants to support and pray for one another. I have heard of more ministers connecting with each other through Zoom during these times than before. It's classic that ministers tend to be lonely people. How can we encourage each other? How can uh, church leaders encourage their pastors and vice versa in the midst of having to learn something new, worrying about the finances, worrying about whether those people under 40 are doing Peloton rather than church, and the people over 50 are sitting on their sofa and closing their laptops when the service is over, and how that's all going to end up. How can we introduce the concepts of encouragement and commitment and covenant? Have you seen examples of ways that, or do you have suggestions of ways we can do that?
I'm just looking at you, Lee.
Well, so before we talk about specifics, I will say that a little word of encouragement does go a long way. To have somebody come up and say, "Hey, this has been a tough 18 months for you, and you've had to navigate an unprecedented pandemic in the midst of trying to do interim work." I've had a couple people say, and that's very encouraging to me to say, "Hey, somebody's recognizing the challenge that I'm facing." Um, a number of years ago, gosh, I guess it's going on 10 or so, I was able to participate in the Presbyterian Church's Credo program, which is a 8-day retreat from the denomination to encourage pastors. And that experience, I felt that the denomination finally said, "Thanks for your commitment and your sacrifice for doing this work." And so I would say that a word of encouragement to a pastor really does go a long way. So that's the before. Now you want to say, what are some specific things to do, Stan?
Well, I would tell you one of my fun experiences last summer was to be involved with a ministry to men in a congregation. They had 70 men meet on Zoom, and these were all business people. It turns out every one of them is under the same exhaustion, uncertainty, and pressure. It used to be you would say, "Oh, the pastor works like the hardest." No, this is so whatever exhaustion a pastor may feel in himself is reflected in the people of God they're serving. And I think you already touched on something, Ken. When you mentioned the group, more pastors connecting, uh, using the micro group concept that Lee alluded to, I would say to any pastor, get in a group of 8 or less that meets regularly. Zoom is fine, and talking to other people where the sense of confidentiality is so high and mutual support is so deep and prayer for each other is so significant that I can not only get encouragement, I can actually get clearer thinking about what I'm doing. So it's not just a support group. It's not just a quote clergy support group where we do lectio and we share a couple of problems and we hang up. No, we do that stuff. But it's how can I be steel in your backbone? How can I push you a little, but only to the degree you want to be? Uh, And that's only going to happen in these smaller frames. The old curricula don't work today.
Right.
And anybody who thinks they're going to work, we're going to go back to a women's association, PW. We're going to go back to a regular grade at Sunday school. I've got some land to sell.
Yeah, that's one of the things that we keep hearing, and I'm not sure that we want to hear it or listen to it or live into it, is that there is no going back. This pandemic has accelerated a process that was going to happen anyway. And whether we are excited about it or not, the world is going virtual, and that hybrid form of some in person and some online is here to stay. There will never come a time when we can go back to January of 2020, where everything is at the church or wherever it was. And I love your idea of the smaller pods, the smaller groups of 5 to 8, no more than 8 people, of meeting together and sharing and encouraging. I think that's vital as we go through these times.
It doesn't have to be 8, 3 people, 4 people. Lee and I, of course, we talk every week to podcast, but we also talk about other things. And if there's a frustration or a concern or just curiosity, we're there for each other. It's a big deal.
Yeah, I think that goes back to the initiative thing, is that it may be that the pastor who needs encouragement reaches out to 2 or 3 folks and says, "Hey, let's get together for 45 minutes once a week over Zoom and just encourage one another." And I bet if a pastor would do that, he or she would find 2 or 3 people pretty quickly, because I think we're all in this same struggle.
I was talking to Kim Snyder, a wonderful leader of adult ministry at the Vienna Presbyterian Church, just struggling about how to connect with people during this pandemic. And she said, we need to think about touch points. A touch point could be just as simple as just an in-out. It could be more formal, like prayer covenants, prayer partnerships. It could be Zoom groups. But the very idea, to me, would allow groups to just brainstorm. It's time for mud on the wall. It's time to try stuff. And some of it will fall. So what? My 7-year-old grandson and I together are going to learn piano. I know nothing about piano, believe it or not. I don't know the difference between middle C and vitamin C. And so he and I are working through an online program. And the teacher this week was talking about improvisation. And I thought, that is the word for where the church is today. It's a great word. And there's the freedom to do something that sounds great or sounds stupid. But I would rather today be a pastor who launched pods and microgroups, and a third of them failed.
Sure.
If a third of them would work.
And I think that those principles of improv, really apply to what your ministry is in terms of encouragement. I remember doing a little study a few years ago and actually preached a sermon or two about it. The improv is based on 2 words. The first one is yes. So that when someone is improvising, you respond with yes. You go with what they are improvising. And the second word is and, so that you build on what they start. So improvisation is based on the idea of responding with yes and then I'm going to do this, building on what you have done, which I think is a great principle for encouragement of one another. Okay, I'm going to go with what you're doing there, and let's do this along with that. Builds on each other.
Ken, that reminds me of one of Stan's 12 transforming principles about permission-giving leadership. that what we do is say, yes, go and try that. As long as it connects to the overall mission and vision of the church, you don't need to run everything by a permission giving
Yeah.
board. You just
Yeah.
do it.
I love that. Yes, and I'm going to hang up and go think about that. And I tell you, cluing off what you said, Lee, it would say to me, to every pastor, you still work to raise up with others your core leadership, your elders, and so on. Well, what kind of people would you want to be an elder during a pandemic? I would want yes and elders. I would want permission giving elders. I would want elders who absolutely are light on their feet, that get pivot, that get nimble, that are not hard edged, or because otherwise either they'll win and you're frozen or you're chewed up. And if that means you have an ex officio role, which means the right to speak, you actually lead. This is a big deal to help leadership form that wants to run with you.
The opposite of encouraging is discouraging, which, if you take it apart, means you take the courage out of somebody to do something. And certainly there's a time and a place for evaluation and critique. But in a time of improvisation and trying new things, that yes and idea of encouraging, giving them the courage to move forward with something new is, I think that's just key. I just think that's so vital. It always has been, but I think particularly right now.
You remember the Atkins diet? The Atkins diet a few years ago was no carbohydrates. And I would say to our senior leaders, suppose you are in charge of a Krispy Kreme store. When you meet, what do you talk about? Do you talk about international relationships? Do you talk about who gets to run a Krispy Kreme store? No, you're trying to figure out how to win people. Well, that's where
In an
we
Atkins
are.
diet world, yeah.
Yeah. When our General Assembly meets, it always has some huge topics it's wrestling with. But if you go back over the last 30 years of them, and I've done this, almost none of them are helping the individual pastor and her congregation figure out how to be more fruitfully reaching people and growing at the same time. It's just all this other stuff. Not that other stuff doesn't have a
It's got its
place. I'm
place
not
and it's
saying that.
important, right?
What initially almost certainly inspired many people to become pastors was the sheer joy of seeing people connect more deeply with the Lord who loves them, seeing people loved through situations. And the pandemic has kind of separated them from that. But our people are still desperately hungry. I just got a text from a businessman running a company. He's just incredibly stressed, but he had realized the God who loved him was with him on a certain day. Well, that totally fired me up. Well, how to encourage the business people, the school people, the whoever people in our congregations to be experiencing the reality of their Lord and sharing it. That's what got us into this.
We get joy out of seeing other people experience that, because at some point in our lives we experienced that and continued to, and we want to see other people find that meaning and joy as well. And in these days, that becomes more difficult because all the ways we used to do it don't work anymore. But it's still there, and I love the fact that you're suggesting small steps. This does not have to be overwhelming. It can be a small step. I loved your idea, Stan, of at the end of a service, give a link to something or someone that they can click on and either do something in response or look into something more deeply or connect with people who are doing mission in that area. Just a link. Just that's all you got to do is put a link on there that helps people respond to the good news that they just experienced in that service.
And a thought that comes to me was something an early mentor of mine told me. He said, a lot of people think from a pastor's view that the church is a spoke and not a web. That if you're the center of a wagon wheel and all the people are spokes to you, you're limited by your energy, and there's no way you can really know all these people. The issue is how to create a web so complex that if the center leaves, nobody even really knows it. Not that they wouldn't, which is why starting things like micro groups, just, 4 weeks long, 6 weeks long, believable, but getting people connected who are not necessarily already best buddies.
I think that this concept of encouragement in our current divisive culture is really important. One of the things that I am trying to impress upon people in my current situation is that eventually the pandemic will be over, and our opinions on how to respond to the pandemic won't matter. But how we have treated one another is what will last. And so whether we agree or disagree with someone else, it is important for us as we live out our Christian faith to be kind to one another, and to encourage one another, because it's the relationships that will be left behind. And we want those relationships to have been built up and not torn down. And so I think being intentional about being kind and encouraging to one another, even those who we disagree with, I think is really paramount in this day and time.
Well said. Well said. I think that's a great place to stop and wrap it up. My deep thanks to Stan and Lee for being with us today and encouraging us to encourage one another. I hope you will find ways to be intentional about nurturing your own spirit, as well as offering words of encouragement to the people in your life. Thanks again for joining us, and thank you for your leadership of Christ's body. If you have any feedback to offer, email me at Pastors4Pastors2020@gmail.com. That's Pastors4Pastors2020@gmail.com. Until next time, I'm Ken Broman, folks, and this is Pastors for Pastors.